So I thought I'd just jump straight in and kind of go from the beginning. So obviously you did a degree in medicine before you became a filmmaker. And for you, did the study of medicine influence filmmaking? And what kind of made you make that permanent shift into the entertainment sphere?
Well, yes, in retrospect, studying medicine was a big thing because it was kind of an apprenticeship for filmmaking. To be a doctor, you take histories from people. Anybody here studying medicine? I know there's one person. But you take someone's history in order to get to understand what's going on. You look at a human being, or you see a human being, usually at a moment of extremis, close to death, in childbirth, or whether it's never a normal situation. You're also looking at it from looking at other humans from a very, very varied points of view, which is what filmmaking is a big requirement of filmmaking. You're looking at a person as a total human being. You're looking at a specific organ. Sometimes during surgery, or if you're assisting with surgery, you're looking inside. You're looking at them down microscopes. You're looking at them in terms of epidemiology. So you're getting a very privileged perspective of other human beings. All of those things serve the filmmaking to an enormous degree. It took me a long time to realise that, so there's a big overlap. And on a purely practical level, a lot of filmmaking is about problem solving, optimal problem solving, so that was something also that was very useful. And also shooting night shoots when you're sleep deprived and exhausted reminded me a lot of working back in the day in a big city hospital where you'd work, there was nothing to work, 100 hours a week, and having to make decisions when you're pretty well exhausted and sleepless. So all of those things were very useful in the filmmaking.
And then what did sort of prompt the shift from being then a doctor to a full-time filmmaker?
Well, I would say, it was a slow process. It was a slow dissolve, as it were. I was always interested in film. I wanted to be a doctor from when I was 8 years old. And I have a twin brother who didn't want to be a doctor. He wanted to do something else. I'm not sure. But we both drew, and I would paint and so on, all the way through school, high school, and at university. And when I was at university in Australia, it was a time when you were free to roam on campus. And I went to architecture lectures, I went to a whole lot of I went to drama lectures and so on. So it was it was a very free time. There wasn't that pressure to get everything done. I don't know what it's like here, but at least that was the case back then. So I was kind of self-taught in filmmaking, I guess. And even though there was no opportunity to make film. And then one day, why I mentioned my twin brother, 2 weeks before we went to enroll, he decided to go to medical school with me. That was a big advantage because during the pre-clinical years, he'd take all the lectures and I'd go off to the movies. And it was a very, very useful thing. And then just as I graduated, I got my hands on I had the opportunity to make a really short film which won a prize, the prize of which was to go to a film workshop in another city, Melbourne, and there I met a number of people who subsequently became important to the Australian film industry. That was the early 70s, a long time ago. So there was never any intention to make films. made one short in particular, which resulted in it ended up in the theatres. And with the kind of arrogance that you get when you're young, we decided with my partner Byron Kennedy to make a feature film, and that was Mad Max. And I thought, in making that film, I thought I'm definitely not cut out to make movies. It was so difficult. It's by far the most difficult film I've ever had to make. We had very little money and we had no experience. But we had enthusiasm and had really worked hard in its preparation. Everything went wrong. It felt like a big dog going for a walk with a really big dog, and you want to go this way and the dog drags you off this way. And I subsequently realised it's like that every time you go out and make a film. But then I virtually gave up. But by some amazing miracle, it had traction. There were things in the film which somehow meant things to people in different countries in the world. In Japan, they thought it was a samurai movie. I'd never seen a Kurosawa movie, but somehow it resonated. In the French saw it as a Western on wheels in Scandinavia. It tapped into the collective unconscious in the typical way that Joseph Campbell so brilliantly described, and it had enough merit in that people are still watching that film somewhere after 30 years, and all I see are the faults in it. But the great thing about it, it stopped me from getting arrogant and thinking I really understood it, because the truth of it is I felt very fraudulent, and that's a great thing. It kept me humble and made me really determined to learn as much from the process as I possibly could, and I just kept making movies. I kept practicing as a doctor for quite a while because I'd never thought I'd keep doing it. My twin brother is still practicing as a doctor, and even though he decided at the last moment, he's a brilliant doctor. He's a wonderful, wonderful doctor, and I don't know that I would have been so good. Yeah.
And kind of in that vein, you said you approached then Mad Max with sort of fervent enthusiasm, and that was the driving force.
Yeah.
Behind your other projects, which are slightly more eclectic compared to Mad Max, so Happy Feet, Babe. For you, what draws you to a project? Is it kind of the conceptual ideas, the screenplay, the actors? For you, what makes you pursue a project?
I'd say it's that and much more, all of those things and much more. It's a comprehensive process. There are multiplicities of factors as to what draws you to a film. And the best way to describe it is to say that like any endeavour we make to communicate one to another, it's in any art, let's say, it's a full body experience. It's apprehended by the entire human being. So a film has to work viscerally, emotionally, intellectually, in terms of it has to work in the context of its time, in terms of its cultural anthropology, its politics, and ultimately mythologically. It has to tick all those boxes, I believe, and more. So you're drawn to it almost intuitively. There's a kind of gravitational pull towards towards a particular story. And by story, I don't mean the plotting of events. I mean the experience into which the audience is invited. So sometimes I find myself being drawn to films which are a really interesting technical exercise. If you take if you take something like Happy Feet, which is an animation, I was really interested in that story, but I didn't think it could be made. And then a wonderful cinematographer, Andrew Lesney, who shot the Lord of the Ring movies, showed me the first motion capture of Gollum back in the early 2000s, and and the moment I saw that, I think it was Andy Serkis doing Gollum at that point. The moment I saw that, I thought, we can make these penguins dance. So that technical exercise was also very exciting. So it's multifactorial as to why you choose to tell a particular story.
And kind of in that vein then of cinema being very multidisciplinary, in that way you are interacting with loads of different artists, whether it be cinematographers, visual artists, sound, etc. What can you learn from these individuals, and have you felt you've been moulded more by the teams you've been working with than perhaps by like a project?
Well, of course, everybody you interact with, even if it's not such a good experience, you learn a lot from. But I love working with people who are at the top of their game. It's always an exciting experience. And I've been lucky enough to work with some really very fine practitioners in an amazing range of disciplines. I mean, filmmaking is the most interesting thing about it. It's a comprehensive exercise. There's nothing that is not, you shouldn't be taking into account. So it's the written word, it's the performed word, it's drama, it's performance, it's composition, it's art, it's lighting. But also on many films I've been worked with really, really impressive engineers, particularly on animations, writing algorithms for how snow falls or how penguin feathers move in the wind and so on. And of course composers and writers and artists of all kinds and designers, as well as actors. And I've been able to watch their process firsthand and really get down inside the creative process, probably in a more privileged way than one might normally do. And the one thing I've learned that in every case, no matter what your discipline, the process is the same. That's the most important thing, and that is it's an interplay between the intellect and the intuition. We load up on whatever data, on every information, every bit of the process. We load up our intellect. We cerebrate everything. And somehow that is processed through the intuition. It informs the intuition, and the intuition guides the intellect, and that feedback loop happens to everybody. I've been lucky enough to get to know some physicists. I worked on a project that I was sacked off Contact. We were talking about Contact earlier, back in the 90s, but I worked with Carl Sagan for a year. He and his wife Anne Duran wrote the screenplay, and when I was talking to physicists and I saw that their process, theoretical physicists were going through exactly the same process, say, as a composer. The mathematicians I've talked to go, when they're trying to solve a problem, go through exactly the same process as say, a designer or an actor. So it's that's the unique insight that I was able to get, because I've had to see how so many different people worked. And I've never really experienced anything other than that process. And it's the best analogy is sport. And if you're an elite sportsman, you know the drill. If you play football or basketball or any one of these games, you drill the process. You've got all all your wiring is reworked, all your bodies work towards that. But when you get on the field, you don't have time to think about it. So the intellect, the drilling, the preparation is done in everything leading up to the moment of performance. And then in the moment of performance, you really hand over more than anything else to the intuitive response. And the great actors are like that. The great actors I've worked with have all just put so much work into their preparation, and there's that paradoxical thing, the rigor of the preparation and the abandon of the work itself, where they completely surrender themselves to the moment of performance. It's completely the opposite process, and that's the biggest thing I've learned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
No, it did, thank you.
Yeah.
In a slightly different strand of conversation, I'm sure many audience members will also bring this up. You're very well known, of course, for Mad Max. And I know, especially for Fury Road, you had Eve Ensler come and speak to the female protagonists. Did you ever imagine the film to be such a potent feminist tale? And also, do you think Hollywood's doing enough to champion films led by strong female characters?
Well, Fury Road, it was really interesting with Eve Ensler. You all know who Eve is? She, the warrior kind in Fury Road, obviously we had workshops. In order to make that imaginary world feel as authentic as possible, we had to be very rigorous about it. Nothing was random. Everything had to have the design, had very, very specific strategies. And so when we were talking about the war boys and the warriors, that was like a boot camp. They literally learned to put their own makeup on, use all their weird weapons and drive their vehicles and so on. For the five wives who were basically those that were stolen from the warlord, they had to have an equivalent, and what better than someone like Eve, who's doing amazing work up in the Democratic Republic of Congo with City of Joy, and she happened, luckily enough, she had a break. We were shooting in Namibia, in southern Africa, and she came for a week, and she workshopped with the five wives, not with Charlize, because she was a warrior kind more than she was one of the females. She was their champion, but anyway, and that was very, very useful, particularly for the actors, and somehow it seeps into the work. Interestingly enough, she opened up the workshops, and a lot of the stunt crew went to it as well, just out of interest. And I think that kind of crept by some osmosis into the film. I was pleased with the response of the film. You don't set out to say, to be proselytized, but I knew that the story from the get-go was going to be about the dominance hierarchy and how everyone in that world was commodified in some way. Everybody in that world has the brand of the immortal burnt somewhere on their bodies. All the warriors, the wives, even Max, who's a blood bag, Furiosa, who's one of his Praetorians, and I was pleased that was picked up. That seemed to be resonant, even though the film had been conceived a long time before. I'm glad that people responded to that.
And do you think Hollywood is doing enough to have films that are similar, where there is a very strong female character and it doesn't have to be fully led by?
It feels like they're starting to. I mean, you're seeing it more and more, and I think people are very, very aware of it. And I think people are serious about it. I don't think they see it just as a way of making a film find a bigger audience. I think, look, all art, and particularly cinema, basically feeds off the zeitgeist. It responds to it. And what's out there, basically you interpret it, and you, again, there's a feedback loop there. And I think it's it's in the air, perhaps more than it has been since the early feminism, and I think people are really getting understand its potency, and I think they're responding that way in our stories, and there can always be more of it, but again, I think it's in the air.
Do you think then that relationship of perhaps society informing cinema is maybe going too far, especially given a slightly more tempestuous political climate? Do you think art is becoming too politicised and that it should actually remain just like an entertainment medium solely for just the pleasure of a consumer?
I don't think any piece of work or any film is purely there for entertainment. If it has any currency at all, as I said, it must work on every level. Otherwise, it's forgotten virtually by the time you get to the car park, or by the time you've gone to the kitchen to make another cup of tea. I think if you look at any resonant work in cinema, TV, it's usually something that ticks all the boxes, those that I described before. Experience by the whole human being, even So the political's part of it. The question is how you orchestrate, how all those things are offered up. That's why I said before, story is the experience into which the audience is invited. It's like listen to an orchestra, a well-integrated orchestra. You're hearing all the different sections, but the movie itself seems to be whole. The music itself seems to be whole, and I think that's the same with the movie. There's more to it. There needs to be more to it than meets the eye, and it's synergistic. It's you can't predict the result just from the parts, and I think politics is part of it. I think it's inevitable, and I think if you're a filmmaker, it can't help but for your politics to emerge in the film. You do get a sense after a while, watching movies, or just as you might listen to somebody's song, or read somebody's novel, or see someone's artwork. You do have a sense of what their political views are, or their worldview is, regardless of how much they might try to disguise it or whatever. So I don't think you can divide it. But if you set out to make something that's purely political, it's usually rejected because it's too bombastic, and it's like, take your medicine and so on. If you set out to make something purely entertaining and has no other content, it's usually rejected as well. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, thank you. Come on, talking about the experience of cinema. I know earlier we kind of discussed your first experience of cinema being going to a Saturday matinee, and you the whole family go and watch a piece of art, a piece of cinema. Do you feel with streaming services like Netflix, I know we just discussed this, but like Netflix, like Amazon, it undermines the community sort of collaborative element that makes the cinema experience so great? Or do you think that having that wide accessibility very much outweighs that loss?
Oh, you're asking a really good question. Look, I think the experience I think there's something atavistic about the collective experience. I mean, we all grow up one way or the other sharing stories. We are hardwired for stories. There's no question about that. You simply have to ask yourself a question. Would the world be coherent at all if it wasn't for stories? And stories have a very, very important function, going all the way back to our earliest knowledge of how humankind conducted itself. It's through stories shared stories that we form cultures, whether they're tiny cultures within a family or larger cultures in communities or or timeless cultures like the monomyths of the global monomyth that, again, I refer you to Campbell. Now they're always shared. So, and I think, it's the reason why we had for so long laugh tracks in TV comedies. I mean, there was no one there, but the laugh tracks were there. Then they put audiences in with the performers and so on. We need to share that experience. Cinema is, yet again, at one of those turning points where some disruptive technology comes along or some process and it really throws it out. It's happened. Cinema's, let's say 125 years old. It first started, it was a very private experience, Nickelodeons and so on, and then it became shared. And all along there have been things that threatened it. Sound changed cinema completely. Television, in the post-war, it's only since World War II that the world's had television, let alone now having all these other platforms. And each time cinema was threatened, that collective experience in the dark. I like to call it the secular cathedral. That's always been threatened. In the 50s, that's why they invented stereo, 3D. That's why they invented CinemaScope. Anybody know what CinemaScope is? I'm sorry, Cinerama. Do you know what Cinerama is? Where they actually had 3 cameras trying to do the very opposite of the small television screen. They had 3 cameras projected on a curved screen, so it was totally immersive. It was predated. It was in the 50s and predated, IMAX. They tried everything, and somehow the experience endured. It evolved and changed. So, streaming now, where arguably the best work in moving image is being done on television more than it is in the cinemas. And there's a lot of reasons, really good reasons for that. There tends to be a kind of migration into that with some of the best practitioners around the world. That is something that cinema has to cope with. And you can see it. I think people are saying, well, these big blockbuster spectacles that are best optimally experienced in the cinema with all that sound and the wide screen. I guess it's just a response to seeing people move away from the more intimate cinema experience. But I don't think it'll ever go away. Somehow we'll force ourselves to share it with other people. I see people now, I don't know if you've had that experience, but I see people now with my kids texting each other while they're watching the latest, Game of Thrones or Crown or any of the next Netflix or Amazon hits. Yeah. So that's an attempt to get that shared experience. So it's tricky, but it's always been tricky. It never ever settled into one thing that was comfortable. That's the history of this new cinema language, which again is only 120 years old. It's an acquired language, and we learn to read cinema before we learn to read books in every culture. And it's changing. We're speed reading cinema now, so it's always changing. It's never static, and we who work in that have to be mindful of that all the time.
Okay. Final question from me before I move on to the audience. What do you kind of see on the horizon for yourself in the next 5 to 10 years? Is there a certain bucket list project, or is it kind of whatever comes your way? Do you see it in a more organic way?
Because all my life I've lived inside my head somehow. I grew up in a remote rural town, and even though I was quite social, because I was lucky enough to have as I said, a twin brother and someone I could share things with, and other brothers, and I lived in my head for most of my life. So now all I can do is come up with stories. I've talked to composers and songwriters who do the same thing. They're just there. Some of them take hold, and it's kind of a Darwinian battle in your head. And I've got way more stories, or indeed completed screenplays, than I'll ever have a chance to make. So, but some of them, somehow, you know, it's like I can only describe it as a gravitational pull. They keep on insisting on themselves. Like the ideas keep on popping in your head, the scenes keep on popping in your head, the images and the moments, and you say, oh gee, it'd be great to get one of those on the screen. So there's 2 or 3 of those popping around, and whether I get the opportunity to make them, only time will tell.
Can you share the idea of one or no?
No, because the only reason I don't is because every time I've mentioned a film one way or the other, somehow it jinxes it. I don't like preempting anything, because if it doesn't happen, it's only mine in my head. But you put it out there. Even when you're shooting a film, you think, okay, you know, this may never get onto the screen sometimes. I mean, things happen. As I said, my first film, Mad Max, it went so wrong that we ran out of money to finish it. So I had to edit it myself. Byron Kennedy, my partner, he cut the sound. We were in a small flat. I cut the picture in the kitchen. He cut the sound in the lounge room. And for 1 year on this tiny little screen, I was confronted by every mistake I made. And I tell you, it was the best film school I could ever go to. It took away any hubris or vanity that I had. And it was. I remember reading, and I was utterly surprised by success. And it was lucky. There was a kind of panic in making it, because the budget was so low, and he got his best friend and the best friend of the best friend to invest in the film, and my best friend from school plus his close friends invested. And I thought, we can lose all their money, and there was that kind of panic. So now I've lost the point now. What I was about to say, I never thought that would work. So I prefer not to talk about something until it's actual. I honestly thought that film would never see the light of day. No one would want to see it. And so until something is finished and you say, okay, it's going to be released, I prefer almost not to talk about it. Yeah. Sorry, that's a long, elaborate answer to explain why I don't like talking about projects.
No, thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, now questions from the audience. If you could stand up when you're asking your question, and a mic will be passed to you. So can we go to the member in the front row in the blue shirt? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming again. So you talked a lot about cinema as a language and art in general, mentioning Joseph Campbell as well. So I was wondering, to what extent do you look at mythology or other forms of art to inform your creative experience, given the nature of cinema as a multi-dimensional medium? Do you have certain works of art or stories that have formed a base inspiration for you?
Well, I'd say nothing should escape your inquiry. Nothing. For me, I started by drawing, and then I went to painting. I didn't go to art school or anything. I did that all the way through school. I always found myself next to the best drawer in whatever school I went to, whatever class. And then I became really interested in art. And I was an okay painter. I mean, I know filmmakers like Ridley Scott, who's a great artist, and Guillermo del Toro is a great artist, and so many of them are. I was okay, and I really enjoyed it. If you looked at my If you look at my textbooks, they're always interesting doodles all over them, in my notes and so on. Then, so it was a serious inquiry. Then I got the opportunity to edit my first silly little film. And the moment I added, I experienced that extra dimension of time, where you could play with pieces of time, suddenly that opened some massive door because it suddenly became narrative, which is the biggest question. It's one thing to master, you get some sort of handle on a process. You'll never master cinema, you'll never master any art, but to get a sense that you can do it. But I'll never ever understand the mystery of why we tell each other stories and a narrative. So you're looking for those people who've really made a serious, deep inquiry into it. And the most significant of those was Joseph Campbell, I believe, with it was a 40-year study of comparative religion and folklore, and he was able to put it into his well-known book, particularly A Hero of a Thousand Faces. And if you read his stuff, he basically said it all. That is ultimately very significant work. He was asked what is mythology, and he had a wonderful answer. He said, "It's other people's religion," and he's talking about the potency of stories. There's this shared narrative we have in all cultures across all time. And that's a big inquiry, and that somehow creeps into your film or your storytelling no matter what. And as I said before, think about a world in which there's no stories. It's impossible to survive. Everything has a narrative. You know, how we all got here today. There's the story. We find ourselves talking. Geology is a great narrative. Science is probably the most significant narrative we have as humankind, because through stories we make meaning. Cinema is just a way of doing that. So everything is part of your work. Obviously, when you're studying lighting and cinematography and composition, you're always referring to the great artworks or great photographers. You sit there with cinematography and say, oh, a little bit, you remember what this artist is? You know, Caravaggio is one of my favorite artists. I would love to light everything like Caravaggio if it was appropriate. Your music, you're always referring when you one of the great privileges of working with some wonderful composers, and you're always referring to what's come before. Performance, actors, writing, the music, the musicality of words and performance. So everything, you have to have a very divergent view of the world, not a convergent view, and you have to be multidisciplined and try to get hold of all of it. You never will, but you must do it. I think modern technology makes it much more available to one person. You get a lot of filmmakers now who are doing their own cinematography, who are doing their own editing, who are doing their own music. Several directors are doing that. I mean, I couldn't. I wouldn't have. I have the ability to talk to composers in terms of drama, but I wouldn't have a clue as to how to do it. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, would you like to pick up?
Someone. Oh, so
Yeah.
you put your hand up first. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess my question's related to Me Too movement. I wanted to know if Hollywood was going to reflect on itself and make a film about itself in light of all the revelations that have taken place. What do you think would be a good format for it to do so? Would it be social realism? Would it be magical realism, animation, for it to have the political potency that a film like that should have, given that...
Sorry, I'm missing half your words. Can you just back up? Yeah, if you can.
So I wonder what would be a good format for a Hollywood film on Me Too, sort of
on Me Too?
On Me Too.
Yeah, yeah.
What would be a good format for the Hollywood film to have that political potency? Would it be animation? Would it be a film set in another world? Or would it have to be a film about our world to reflect on it?
Oh, that's a really important, well, a very interesting question, because I think most good films or good stories are allegorical. I think that something that is reality-based, like a documentary, they can have all the hallmarks of great drama, but quite often it doesn't invite the audience in and allow them to interpret it according to their own worldview. So allegory is always, and I'm certainly not the first to say this, George Lucas has said that the Star Wars movies are more political allegories to some degree. And it's interesting, I think I read in the last couple of days, a great filmmaker, Brian De Palma, who made Carrie, he said he's going to do a Weinstein-based story as a horror movie. And exactly, he's writing it. I don't know exactly what he would do, but he's made some significant films, again, in some form of genre. But, really, it doesn't really matter. It can be an animation. You can get some, two of my, I love animation because animations are really interesting because they're for the child and the adult and the child, as all great fairy stories are. My favorite animation is Pinocchio. There's the early Disney Pinocchio. It's an incredibly powerful story dealing with issues of biblical proportions. And has anyone seen Zootopia, the film? Very powerful film about female empowerment, prejudice of all kinds, in this surprisingly entertaining film. A tremendous lot of content, a tremendous amount of iceberg under the tip, as I like to say. And so it doesn't, but I think my honest answer is there's not necessarily one medium that's best to cover something like this. It might be as something as immediate as the personal stories, a mosaic, a collection of the personal stories of the people who were involved and how they felt. But someone, and it's going to get there. It's going to be there in our work. As I said, people, it's part of what's in the air, and it will be there. But someone, very inventive might be able to find an allegorical version through some animation, because all the powerful animations deal with the really big questions like this, all the powerful children's stories and so on. Yeah?
Can I follow? I just wanted to ask, how do you make those connections between the allegorical that might function and the story you're going to tell, or is it just something, again, that combination of the intellect and the intuition?
How do you make the connection?
Right, so I guess I can see how Harry Weinstein's story might work as a horror, but so how do you, I guess you personally, make those allegories, sort of, how do you think of them? What's the thought process that sort of...
The process?
Yeah.
The great value of talking like this is you're forced to really consider the process. All I can say is that, I think you naturally are alert to it, and I talked about the gravitational pull to certain stories, and usually part of it, one of the factors is how do you reflect the world as you see it, or how do you reflect that in a moment in the story? And probably the best example is going back to the last film I made, which is Mad Max Fury Road. There's no question that's allegorical. It wasn't like the most important thing it had to be, but it was one of the boxes to tick. And so I wanted to look at a dominance hierarchy with some patriarchal figure who basically appropriated the religious urge. This is if you've seen the film, there's a guy called Immortan Joe who's implying they're somehow immortal. He's there to take these half-life war boys and make them and deliver them to Valhalla, and he basically sits on top of some citadel, controlling all the resources, the few controlling all the resources over the many. What better way? You don't want complex markets or anything like that. A simple market, water, the one thing that's missing in the wasteland. And then, and everyone in that world is a commodity. Everyone has his brand burnt onto their skin. And people rebel, as they do against all tyrannies. And in this case, it's 5 wives trying to escape him. So the resonances are there, even though it's set in a dystopian future. It sort of goes back, and we see those equivalents in so often through human history, and it's very much about today, or what we're seeing now in the 21st century. So that's not what you set out to do, but you find directly, but you find a world in which you can play and work and hypothesize, and then you start finding strategies within that world to tell a story that seems to have authentic resonances. And your job is to make that world as persuasive as possible. But that's just what happens in my head, and I'm sure there's other ideas like that in the department's head, and no doubt there are people out there who have different ways of saying of telling it.
Yeah. Feel free to choose.
Sorry?
Feel free to choose a hand, or I can choose. It's up to you.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, the member in the grey polo shirt.
Yeah.
One of the many praises given to Fury Road is how engaging the action is. Many films in recent years have had kind of boring or uninteresting action. I'm wondering if you could talk about your process making the action interesting and using it as a form of storytelling.
Well, does anyone ever listen to the podcast 99% Invisible? Do you know? It's a wonderful podcast because most of what we see in the world has hidden architecture, hidden design that we're never really aware of. And I think it applies to everything. And so my answer to the question is quite complex, and much more thought's gone into it than just stringing shots together. It really goes back to what I said before. This is a new language, and if you've read that wonderful book written in the 60s by Kevin Brownlow, The Parade's Gone By, he basically said, very important those who are interested in filmmaking, he said basically that the syntax of cinema was developed before sound. That in the silent movies, the idea of the close-up, the wide shot, all those things were basically developed at that point. People say and I don't know if this is true or not, but they say that when people first saw a close-up of a man's head turning in the cinema in the silent era, they screamed because they thought it was an enlarged, disembodied head. Now, a kid could see that today, a baby almost, and read something differently. So it's an acquired language, and it probably, Brownlow's thesis was that the parade's gone by. All of cinema was invented, the language of cinema was invented by sound. Now it's changed since then because we've had one very disruptive technology, and that's the digital dispensation, where we have we can do virtually anything now, and we're reading films more quickly. So the thing about Fury Road and its action, the first thing about it is it had to play as a silent movie. Margaret Siegsel, who edited this film, who also happens to be my partner, she understood that very, very well. She wanted to play it, every part of it, so that it read like a silent movie. Didn't even put the dialogue in. And because if you can read, say, an impact, if you can read the direction in which things were travelling, if your eye scan is such that it follows smoothly, so that there is a causal relationship between one shot and the next, so that it's not that confusing sort of false action that you get from too many movies, I think, where it just refreshes the screen with a new cut every couple of seconds or even less. It was very, very deliberate, where, particularly on the big screen, exactly where the majority of eyes in the cinema would be looking at any given moment. A huge amount of attention was put into that. Often it was the plasticity of the screen is so much now, particularly when you're working digitally, is that you can play with focus, so you can make something sharper, so that the eye is more likely to go to it. You can change the colour pattern. You can put vignettes. These are very, very subtle things, but many, many techniques. And we were talking earlier about the value of digital, working digitally. The frame itself is much, much more plastic, and you can really direct the eye. Like it's a little bit like, again, the musical analogy. If you hear some music and there's no false notes and the progressive notes one to the other, if it's smooth, then you lose yourself in the experience. And I think that those same ideas applied to the cutting of action of something like Fury Road. It's visual music in a way, and it wasn't just stringing one shot to the other. There was a lot of thought, and ultimately, I'd say the most important thing that we really tried to remember. And this started in the writing, obviously in the execution of the film, and in the post-production, is that every bit of action must inform you about the character or the relationship between characters. It must be dramatically driven. It's not just something, noise and movement to dazzle the eye and to distract you. It's the equivalent of dialogue. There has to be all the craft of normal drama, of the interaction between characters and so on. It's just done through action. I guess that's in the choreography. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think we only have time for about one more question. So it falls on you to choose the lucky one.
It seemed to be urgent.
It's the member in the hoodie. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. You talked a lot about how you have so many ideas in your head, and I was wondering, and if you could, with an example, talk about how you've taken just the seed of an idea or a shot or a scene in your head and sort of expanded that into a full-fledged work.
Yes. Well, it's a strange thing. I was working on Fury Road. we worked with differently. Again, in line with the notion that it's basically a silent movie, we mapped out a story. Brendan McCarthy and I, who's a graphic artist, a wonderful graphic artist, and we boarded the whole film. There was eventually a screenplay, but it was an illustrated screenplay because picture's worth 1,000 words and so on. And halfway through the process, and then we brought in Nico Luthouris, who's a big mentor to me, a dramaturg and an actor. And halfway through the process, they turned to me, and I remember Brendan said, "George, you think in terms of scenes, don't you?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, when you come up with an idea, you see the whole scene. And I thought, it feels like I do. And I realized what quite often that's the case. It comes to me fully formed in some way. But when I really interrogate that, it's usually very misty, but there's a kind of little Geiger counter, a dramatic Geiger counter. You know what a Geiger counter is, or some little sensor that goes tick, 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 and that draws itself to where I think there's a lot of drama to be mined. And so I will say that sometimes they do come, it's probably a habit now, but they do play out sometimes not quite fully formed. Again, they're hazy and misty, but there's a sense of a whole there. And it's something I'm habituated to. It's just something that has happened. It's not. I imagine someone. The musical equivalent is someone who a whole riff or a whole passage of a song comes out of some accidental trigger, and usually, again, that you think about it, that fuels the intuition, and the intuitive response makes it more whole. I think that's probably what happens to most people. Do you sense that?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I sort of have a small seed of an idea, and I find myself chasing it, but it's been difficult to sort of realize the entire work from that small piece.
And the reason why you chase that seed, it grows to a certain point and then runs out of steam. Yeah, that's the most difficult thing. I would say the most difficult thing, you probably heard this a lot, the most difficult thing is rewriting. It's much harder than writing in the first place. I've known a lot of very good writers and filmmakers who can write a great first draft, but don't have the energy or the pig-headedness or the craft to simply go back and re-examine it and dismantle a bit, to look at that hidden architecture we're talking about and be able to somehow improve the work. A lot of people rewrite, but somehow get lost in that process. So and the best thing I can say is take all that craft knowledge that you read in all the textbooks on screenwriting and dramatic writing, take the work that you've written and interrogate it through those crafts, whichever form you like. They're just tools. Apply the tools to the work and see where it falls down. It happens to me all the time, and you suddenly see, my God, that was such a stupid mistake. Why was I going down that track? And you just need you just need to have the sort of belief that if you keep working at it and you're completely honest and you're not afraid, you're not crushed by those very confronting truths that something's not working. There's a chance that you'll find your way out of it. That's the only thing. It happens to everybody. it certainly happens to me in the work I do, and there's a kind of paradox to it. I'm always interested in the paradox. On the one hand, you've got to be incredibly rigorous, almost to an obsessive degree. On the other hand, you've got to be completely free and abandon yourself to the intuition. The intuition will always rule. I don't believe, when someone plays some music, the conductor is not moving the fingers of the violinist. The violinist is interpreting the music on behalf of the collective work and surrendering themselves with all that discipline to the spirit of the music. And I think you've got to do all the practice and whatever, and then free your intuition to sort of find those solutions. That's all I can say. It's really interesting talking to mathematicians when they have to have breakthrough on something. It's interesting how that happens. They do exactly the same thing. They're working. Any mathematicians here? They work on something. They work on it. It's intractable, and then they go off and do anything but work on that problem, and then suddenly, that little idea comes and gets you back into it. It's the same process.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank you so much, George Miller, for such an engaging and perceptive talk. And if you could all join me in thanking Mr. Miller.